Now that your husband is dead, pack your bags and get out of this house. Those were the words my daughter-in-law chose to say to me just 7 days after we buried my husband. What hurt even more was that my son didn't argue. He didn't defend me. He didn't even look surprised. He simply lowered his eyes and nodded as if this conversation had already happened long before I walked into that dining room. My name is Margaret Dawson. I am 71 years old, and until that night I believed I still had a family. The dining room felt wrong without Robert. The large oak table that had witnessed 32 years of birthdays, Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas mornings, and ordinary Tuesday conversations suddenly felt cold and unfamiliar. His chair sat empty at the end of the table. I kept glancing toward it without thinking, almost expecting him to clear his throat or reach for his coffee mug. Grief does strange things to the mind. 1 week earlier, I had stood beside his grave holding a bouquet of white lilies while trying to understand how a man who had shared every day of my adult life could simply be gone. Every room in the house still carried traces of him. His reading glasses remained on the nightstand. His favorite sweater still hung behind the bedroom door. Even his coffee cup sat in the cabinet exactly where he had left it. I was still learning how to breathe without him. Then came Vanessa's words. Sharp. Cold. Final. This house is too much for you now, she said. You need to move on. I looked at Brian, my only son. The little boy who used to run into my arms after school. The teenager whose broken heart I had comforted after his first breakup. The man whose college tuition Robert and I worked overtime to pay. He wouldn't meet my eyes. It's for the best, Mom, he said quietly. That was all. For words. For words that somehow erased decades of sacrifice. I expected anger. I expected tears. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Maybe grief had already exhausted every emotion inside me. Maybe losing Robert had prepared me for losing everything else. I simply nodded. I finished my dinner in silence. I washed my plate. I thanked Vanessa for the meal. Then I walked upstairs to the bedroom I had shared with my husband and sat on the edge of the bed. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs. My hands rested on my lap while moonlight spilled through the curtains. That was when I noticed something I had overlooked before. Taped beneath Robert's nightstand drawer was a small envelope with my name written across the front in his unmistakable handwriting. My heart stopped. Slowly I opened it. Inside was a brass key and a single handwritten sentence. I read it once, then twice, then a third time because I could hardly believe what I was seeing. It said, "If they ever betray you, Margaret, take this key to First National Bank. Everything will make sense." I sat there for a long time with the key resting in my palm. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the bedroom window, and somewhere downstairs the grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. It sounded almost like a heartbeat. Robert's heartbeat. For 32 years, he had always been the calm one between us. The planner. The careful observer. The man who noticed things long before anyone else did. Looking at that key, I realized he must have seen something coming. Maybe not exactly this, but enough to leave me a path forward. I slept very little that night. Around 5 in the morning I packed a single suitcase. Not because Vanessa had ordered me to leave, but because I needed answers more than I needed comfort. The house felt different as dawn arrived. Pale sunlight stretched across the hardwood floors. The family photographs lining the hallway suddenly seemed like artifacts from another life. In one picture, Brian was 8 years old, holding a fishing rod beside Robert at Lake Harmon. In another, he stood proudly in his graduation gown while I wiped tears from my eyes. I stopped and looked at those pictures longer than I should have. Somewhere along the way, the little boy I knew had disappeared. At 6:30, I carried my suitcase downstairs. Vanessa was already in the kitchen scrolling through her phone. She barely looked up when she heard me. "Leaving already?" she asked. Her voice carried a strange mixture of surprise and satisfaction. "For a few days," I replied. She nodded without another question. No concern. No curiosity. Nothing. Brian entered a few minutes later. He looked tired. Older than his 43 years. For a moment I thought he might say something. Maybe apologize. Maybe ask where I was going. Instead, he poured himself a cup of coffee and stared into the mug. "Drive safely, Mom," he said quietly. I smiled. I always do. Then I walked out the front door. The drive to First National Bank took just under 40 minutes. The morning traffic moved slowly through downtown, giving me too much time to think. My hands tightened around the steering wheel each time I remembered Robert's note. Everything will make sense. It was such a simple sentence, yet it echoed in my mind the entire drive. By the time I parked, my stomach was tied in knots. The bank itself looked unchanged from the dozens of times Robert and I had visited over the years. The same brick exterior, the same polished glass doors, the same American flag waving gently near the entrance. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and paper. A young receptionist greeted me with a professional smile. When I showed her the brass key, her expression shifted immediately. She picked up the phone and quietly called someone. Less than 2 minutes later, a gray-haired man in a navy suit appeared from a hallway behind the lobby. "Mrs. Dawson?" he asked. "My name is Charles Whitmore. We have been expecting you." Those 6 words sent a chill through me. Expecting me. Robert had arranged something here long before his death. Charles led me down a private corridor toward a secure area of the bank. As we walked, he glanced at me with an expression that looked surprisingly sympathetic. "Your husband was a remarkable man," he said softly. "He wanted to make sure you were protected." Protected from what? I wanted to ask. But deep down, I was beginning to suspect I already knew the answer. Charles stopped in front of a heavy steel door and entered a security code. The lock clicked open with a quiet mechanical sound that seemed much louder in the silence surrounding us. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. I followed him into a private room furnished with a polished wooden table, 2 leather chairs, and a small lamp that cast a warm glow across the surface. It did not feel like a bank. It felt like a place where important truths waited patiently for the right moment to be revealed. Charles gestured for me to sit. Then he placed a thick folder on the table. My name was written across the front in Robert's handwriting. For a moment I could not move. Seeing his handwriting again felt like hearing his voice from another room. Familiar. Comforting. Painful. I ran my fingers gently across the cover before opening it. Inside were documents, letters, account statements, and several sealed envelopes. Everything was organized with the precision Robert brought to every part of his life. Charles remained silent while I turned the first page. The document was dated nearly 4 years earlier. I frowned. 4 years. Long before Robert became sick. Long before anyone imagined we would be sitting in funeral homes and cemetery chapels. The realization made my stomach tighten. He had not created this plan at the last minute. He had been preparing it for years. The first letter was addressed directly to me. "Margaret, if you are reading this, it means circumstances unfolded exactly as I feared they might. Do not panic. Do not rush. Read everything before making any decisions." I paused and stared at those words. Robert knew me well. He knew my tendency to act from emotion whenever family was involved. He knew I would want answers immediately. The next several pages explained things I never expected to learn. Over the last decade, Robert had quietly transferred a significant portion of our assets into trusts and accounts that only he and the bank knew existed. Not because he distrusted me. Quite the opposite. According to his notes, he feared that someday someone might try to pressure me into surrendering what we had built together. As I continued reading, memories began surfacing. Small moments that had seemed insignificant at the time. Vanessa asking detailed questions about property values. Brian bringing up inheritance laws during casual conversations. Discussions about downsizing that appeared out of nowhere. At the time I dismissed them. Now those memories returned with sharper edges. Charles finally spoke. "Your husband visited this bank several times each year. He updated these files regularly." I looked up. "He expected this?" Charles chose his words carefully. "He hoped it would never be necessary. But he believed preparation was better than regret." I lowered my eyes back to the folder. Near the bottom sat a sealed envelope marked "Open Last." The handwriting looked slightly different, as though it had been written during one of Robert's final visits. My fingers hovered above it. Something told me that whatever waited inside would change everything I thought I knew about my family. Slowly, I broke the seal and unfolded the letter hidden within. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the final letter. For a moment the room disappeared. The bank, the table, even Charles sitting quietly across from me. All of it faded behind the familiar shape of Robert's words. Margaret, if you have reached this letter, then something has happened that confirmed my fears. First, I need you to remember something important. None of this is your fault. You loved our family exactly as you were supposed to. You trusted because that is who you are. I stopped reading and closed my eyes. I could almost hear his voice speaking the words. Robert had always known how to calm a storm without raising his voice. Even now, months after his passing, he was somehow doing it again. I continued reading. Over the past several years, I noticed changes that troubled me. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Questions about ownership. Questions about inheritance. Questions about what would happen after I was gone. At first, I convinced myself I was imagining things. Then I started paying closer attention. My stomach tightened. The memories came back immediately. Vanessa asking detailed questions about property taxes during holiday dinners. Vanessa casually bringing up retirement communities. Vanessa commenting that large houses were wasted on older people living alone. At the time I brushed those comments aside. Robert clearly had not. The next page contained detailed notes. Dates. Observations. Small incidents that seemed harmless on their own, but formed a troubling pattern when viewed together. Robert had documented everything. Not because he wanted conflict. Because he wanted certainty. One note caught my attention immediately. Brian asked whether the house title could be transferred without probate. Another note followed 6 months later. Vanessa requested copies of property records. Then another. Discussion about future ownership while Margaret was not present. I felt a chill spread through my chest. The evidence was not dramatic. There were no explosive revelations. That somehow made it worse. It was careful, quiet, gradual. Like watching cracks spread across a foundation year after year. Charles remained silent while I read. His expression suggested none of this surprised him. Finally I looked up. Did Robert show you these? Charles nodded slowly. Many of them. He wanted independent documentation. I lowered my eyes again. The final pages revealed something completely unexpected. Robert had not simply protected our savings. He had transferred ownership of several key assets into a trust designed exclusively for my benefit. The family home, investment accounts, properties I barely remembered owning. Everything had been structured in a way that prevented anyone from forcing decisions on my behalf. I stared at the numbers in disbelief. For months I had worried about surviving alone, worried about bills, worried about the future. Yet Robert had quietly secured all of it. Then I reached the final paragraph. If Brian remains the man we raised, none of these protections will ever matter. If he does not, trust the documents. Trust the truth. Most importantly, trust yourself. Tears filled my eyes for the first time since entering the bank. Not because of the money. Not because of the assets. Because even in death, Robert had believed in me when I had stopped believing in myself. I carefully folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. Then Charles slid one final document across the table. There is something else your husband instructed us to show you if this day ever came, he said quietly. I looked down at the file. Across the top was a date from nearly 2 years earlier. Beneath it was a transcript of a private meeting. And the first name listed on the page was Vanessa Dawson. For several seconds I simply stared at the name on the page. Vanessa Dawson. The letters seemed almost unreal. Part of me wanted to believe there had been some mistake. Some innocent explanation. But deep down I already knew better. Charles slid the document closer. Your husband requested that this remain sealed unless specific circumstances occurred, he said quietly. I nodded and began reading. The meeting had taken place nearly 2 years earlier. According to the transcript, Vanessa had requested a private consultation regarding estate planning. At first, the conversation appeared ordinary. Questions about trusts. Questions about inheritance procedures. Questions about property ownership after the death of a spouse. Then the tone changed. One paragraph after another revealed a level of interest that felt deeply personal. Not personal as a daughter-in-law concerned about family stability. Personal as someone calculating future opportunities. Vanessa had repeatedly asked what would happen if assets were transferred before probate. She had asked how quickly ownership could change hands after a death. She had even asked whether surviving spouses could be persuaded to relinquish rights voluntarily. My chest tightened with every page. None of those questions were illegal. None of them proved wrongdoing. Yet together they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Robert must have seen the same thing. He must have recognized the pattern long before I did. As I continued reading, another detail caught my attention. Vanessa had not attended the meeting alone. A second name appeared several times throughout the transcript. Brian Dawson. I froze. The room suddenly felt smaller, colder. Until that moment, some part of me had continued searching for excuses on my son's behalf. Perhaps he was being influenced. Perhaps he was overwhelmed. Perhaps grief had clouded his judgment. But there, in black and white, was evidence that he had been involved years before Robert passed away. I closed my eyes. Images flooded my mind. Family barbecues in the backyard. Christmas mornings beside the fireplace. Brian learning to ride a bicycle while Robert jogged beside him down our driveway. Every memory collided with the document resting on the table. Charles remained silent, giving me space to process everything. Finally, I looked up. Robert knew. My voice sounded distant, even to me. Charles nodded slowly. He suspected enough to prepare. I looked back at the pages. Suddenly, several conversations from recent years made sense. The repeated suggestions that we should sell the house. The subtle pressure to simplify our finances. The concern about whether maintaining property would become difficult as we aged. None of it had seemed threatening at the time. It had been wrapped in concern, wrapped in smiles, wrapped in family language. Yet now the pattern was impossible to miss. I carefully placed the transcript back into the folder. The hurt was still there, deep and heavy, but something else had begun taking shape beside it. Clarity. For the first time since Robert's funeral, I no longer felt confused. I no longer felt powerless. Then Charles opened a drawer beside the table and removed a small sealed package. There is one final item, he said. Your husband instructed us to release this only after you reviewed everything else. I stared at the package. Across the front, written in Robert's handwriting, were 6 simple words. For Margaret. When she is ready. I stared at the package for several seconds before touching it. The paper was slightly yellowed around the edges, as if it had been waiting a long time for this moment. Robert had always believed in timing. He never rushed important decisions. Looking at the package, I realized this was no different. He had prepared it years ago and trusted that if I ever opened it, I would be ready to understand what it meant. Carefully, I broke the seal. Inside was a small flash drive, another handwritten letter, and a photograph. The photograph caught my attention immediately. It showed Robert and me standing on the front porch of our house nearly 20 years earlier. We were younger then. Smiling. Holding fresh paint brushes after spending an entire weekend restoring the old railings ourselves. I remembered that day. We were exhausted. Sunburned. Happy. On the back of the photograph, Robert had written a simple sentence. This house belongs to the woman who built a life inside it. My vision blurred. I set the photograph down and opened the letter. Margaret, if you are reading this, then you already know enough to understand why I created these protections. What I need you to understand now is that this was never about money. It was about respect. It was about making sure no one could rewrite the story of what we built together. I swallowed hard and continued reading. The letter explained that the flash drive contained recordings, financial records, and copies of legal conversations stored over several years. Nothing illegal. Nothing dramatic. Simply documentation. Robert believed facts mattered more than arguments. Whenever something troubled him, he documented it. Whenever questions arose about ownership, inheritance, or property transfers, he kept records. He called it insurance against confusion. Suddenly, I remembered a conversation we had nearly 3 years earlier. We had been sitting on the back patio watching the sunset. Robert had asked me a strange question. If something happened to me first, would you still know your own worth? At the time, I laughed and told him he worried too much. He smiled but never answered. Now, sitting in that private room, I finally understood why he asked. He was not worried about finances. He was worried about whether I would allow other people to convince me that my place in the family had expired once he was gone. The final page contained specific instructions. Do not confront anyone yet. Do not reveal what you know. Give people room to show you who they really are. The truth always becomes clearer when people believe they have already won. I lowered the letter and sat quietly. The anger I expected to feel never arrived. Instead, I felt something steadier, stronger. For weeks I had been reacting to events, reacting to grief, reacting to loneliness, reacting to betrayal. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt as though I was standing on solid ground again. Charles watched me carefully. Are you all right? He asked. I nodded. I think I am. And surprisingly, it was true. Then he opened another folder and slid a property report across the table. I glanced at the first page and froze. According to the document, someone had already contacted a real estate broker about selling the family home. The inquiry had been submitted only 3 days after Robert's funeral, and the name listed beside the request was Brian Dawson. For a long moment I could not breathe. 3 days. Robert had been gone for only 3 days when the inquiry was submitted. 3 days after the funeral. 3 days after family members stood together speaking about love, loyalty, and remembrance. I stared at the report while a heavy silence settled over the room. The date remained unchanged no matter how many times I looked at it. Brian had contacted a real estate broker before Vanessa ever told me to leave. Before our conversation at the dinner table. Before I packed a suitcase. The decision had already been made. I was never part of it. Charles quietly pushed a second page toward me. The broker's notes were brief but revealing. The prospective sellers were interested in moving quickly. They anticipated the property becoming available soon. They wanted an estimate of market value and expected closing timelines. My eyes stopped on one sentence. Occupancy issues expected to be resolved shortly. Occupancy issues. That was me. 32 years of marriage. Decades of mortgage payments. Countless holidays. Countless sacrifices. Reduced to 2 words in a broker's file. Yet strangely I did not cry. The pain was still there, but it felt different now. Cleaner. The uncertainty was gone. There is a strange kind of peace that comes when confusion finally disappears. For weeks I had questioned myself. Had I misunderstood Vanessa? Was grief making me overly sensitive? Was Brian simply overwhelmed by losing his father? Those questions no longer existed. The facts had answered them. I leaned back in my chair and looked through the window of the private room. Outside, people walked through downtown carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Ordinary lives continued moving forward. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt as though mine could move forward too. Not because everything was fixed. Because I finally understood what I was facing. Charles folded his hands. Your husband anticipated this possibility, he said carefully. He instructed us not only to protect the assets but also to give you time. He believed decisions made during grief were often regretted later. I smiled faintly. That sounded exactly like Robert. He had always believed patience revealed character. Looking back, I realized that was precisely what had happened. Nobody forced Brian or Vanessa to act this way. Nobody pressured them. They revealed themselves willingly. The folder sitting in front of me contained years of evidence proving that. I gathered the documents slowly and placed them back inside their envelopes. Then I asked the question that had been forming in my mind since arriving at the bank. What happens now? Charles looked at me for several seconds before answering. That depends entirely on what you want. The answer surprised me. For weeks it felt as though everyone else had been deciding my future. Vanessa, Brian, circumstances, grief. Suddenly the decision belonged to me again. As I stood to leave, Charles handed me a business card. One more thing, he said. Yesterday afternoon, someone called the bank asking whether any accounts had been frozen after your husband's passing. I paused. Who? Charles glanced down at his notes. Then he looked back up. Your daughter-in-law. The drive away from the bank felt different from the drive there. That morning I had arrived carrying grief, confusion, and a suitcase. Now I carried answers. Not all of them, but enough. Robert had spent years preparing for a future he hoped would never happen. The least I could do was honor the effort he made to protect me. Instead of returning home, I checked into a small hotel on the edge of town. It was quiet, clean, and overlooked a lake. The receptionist handed me a room key and wished me a pleasant stay. Such a simple gesture should not have mattered, but after the past week, simple kindness felt extraordinary. I placed my suitcase near the bed and sat by the window. The lake water moved gently beneath the afternoon sun. For the first time since Robert's funeral, I allowed myself to sit still. Not to mourn, not to worry, just to think. Around 6 o'clock my phone rang. Brian. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. Mom. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. Where are you? I looked out at the lake. I am taking a few days for myself. Silence followed. Then he cleared his throat. Vanessa and I were wondering when you plan to come back. Come back. Not because they missed me. Not because they were worried. Because they needed information. I could hear it in his voice. I am not sure yet, I replied calmly. There are a few things I need to take care of first. Another pause. Okay, he said. Just let us know. The call ended less than 2 minutes later. I set the phone down and felt something unexpected. Relief. There had been no argument. No confrontation. More importantly, I had revealed nothing. Robert's words echoed in my mind. Give people room to show you who they really are. The following morning, I opened the flash drive. The contents were carefully organized into folders. Property records. Financial statements. Meeting notes. Correspondence. Robert's attention to detail was remarkable. As I reviewed the files, one pattern became impossible to ignore. Nearly every questionable conversation involved timing. Questions appeared whenever health issues arose. Questions appeared whenever major assets were discussed. Questions appeared whenever future planning entered the conversation. It was never direct. Never obvious. Always disguised as concern. Then I found a recent email exchange. The date stopped me cold. It had been sent only 2 weeks before Robert passed away. The sender was a real estate consultant. The recipient was Vanessa. The subject line read, Preliminary Valuation Report. I opened the document slowly. There it was. An estimated market value for the family home. Notes about renovation opportunities. Potential resale timelines. Everything prepared while Robert was still alive. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. They had not started planning after the funeral. They had started planning long before it. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text message from Vanessa. Hope you are doing well. We should probably discuss the house soon. I stared at the message for a long time before setting the phone face down on the table. Then I smiled for the first time in days. Not because the situation was funny, because for the first time I understood something important. Vanessa believed she was waiting for me to make a decision. She had no idea that Robert had already made one years ago. The next 2 days passed quietly. I kept my phone nearby, but I stopped rushing to answer every message. Grief had taught me that silence reveals more than questions ever can. People become surprisingly honest when they think nobody is paying attention. Vanessa sent 3 more messages. Each one sounded polite on the surface. Each one returned to the same subject. The house. The property. Future plans. Not once did she ask how I was sleeping. Not once did she ask whether I needed anything. Meanwhile, Brian called twice. The conversations were brief and awkward. He sounded distracted, as though he was trying to follow a script he had not written himself. Every time the discussion drifted toward practical matters, his voice became more confident. Every time it touched on family, grief, or memories of Robert, he seemed eager to change the subject. On the 3rd morning, I returned to the files on the flash drive. There was one folder I had not examined closely. Robert had labeled it simply Timeline. Inside were years of carefully organized notes. Dates. Conversations. Copies of correspondence. Looking through them felt like watching a puzzle assemble itself piece by piece. One entry described a family dinner where Vanessa repeatedly asked whether the house was fully paid off. Another documented a conversation about retirement communities. A third referenced a discussion about simplifying estate transfers. None of the individual moments seemed alarming by themselves. Together, they painted a very different picture. Then I found something unexpected. A note written entirely in Robert's handwriting. It was not legal. It was personal. Margaret still sees the best in everyone. That is one of the reasons I love her. It is also why I must prepare for the possibility that others may take advantage of her kindness. I stared at those words for a long time. My entire life I had viewed trust as a strength. Robert clearly agreed. Yet he also understood that trust without protection can become vulnerability. By late afternoon, another message arrived from Vanessa. This one was different. We have scheduled a meeting with a real estate consultant next week. We assumed you would want to be included. I read the message twice. Not because it surprised me, because it confirmed exactly what Robert had anticipated. They were moving forward as though the outcome had already been decided. The assumption itself revealed everything. I looked around the hotel room. The lake shimmered outside the window. A family walked along the shoreline. 2 children chased ducks near the water's edge. Life continued. Ordinary. Peaceful. Unaware of the private storms unfolding elsewhere. For the first time, I did not feel anger toward Brian or Vanessa. I felt something closer to sadness. They were so focused on acquiring something that they failed to notice what they were losing. Trust. Respect. Family. Things far more valuable than any piece of property. That evening I called Charles. I think I am ready, I said. There was a brief pause on the line. Ready for what? He asked. I looked at the folder resting on the table beside me. Then I smiled. Ready to let them believe they are winning a little longer.